Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is a sketch from Texas Life. It says, "There are many pleasures connected with Western frontier life to one who loves to contemplate the beauties of nature as exhibited in the variety of scenery that meets the eye in every direction. From the blooming prairie, whose lovely flowers lade the summer air with softest fragrance, or the rich valleys overspread with nature's own verdant carpetings, to the grand old mountains, whose lofty summits almost pierce the bright blue canopy that, like an angel of peace, overreaches the scene. The eye is constantly enchanted by the wild, picturesque beauty. In looking abroad upon this landscape of almost primeval loveliness, one is prone to think that the polluting breath of sin has never penetrated this lovely retreat. But alas, the delusion is soon dispelled. For oh how often are the hearts of those whose aspirations lead from nature up to nature's God saddened when the holy calm of the Sabbath morning is broken by the loud report of the hunter's gun, whose echoes reverberate along the mountain defiles, starting the mother bird from her quiet nest, and the little squirrel from its timid perch upon a limb, or by the distant sound of a horse's hoofs, as the reckless cow driver gallops over the rocky hills, regardless alike of the laws of man, the sanctity of the day, or the restraints thrown around it by the divine precepts of him who rested on the Sabbath day and hallowed it. But we took not our pen to moralize on the recklessness or degeneracy of frontiersmen, but merely to give an illustrative sketch of their traits and sufferings. It was a beautiful evening in the autumn. An unclouded sun was just sinking in grandeur behind a low range of mountains known as Packsaddle, when sloping sides spread out, forming an extensive valley, along which runs the Llano River, whose murmuring waters, as they sweep restlessly over their pebbly bed, gladdens the heart of many a weary one whose cottage chances to stand upon its mossy banks, and the tired traveler pauses to refresh himself from the limpid stream, or rather the tempting mustang grapes from the vines overshadowing its sequestered bosom, vibrate gracefully to the whispering of the winds among their leaves. There are few settlements in that country, and the bounding deer, fearless of danger, chase each other, while countless herds of cattle and horses run wild over the hills and valleys, the latter furnishing a pretext for the numerous depredations of the Comanche Indians, who coming in drive them away, and find a safe retreat among the lofty mountains farther west. There was some fear entertained by the settlers at the time of which I write, which was during the period when we were groaning under the weight of a commotion, that the Indians, while our armies were engaged elsewhere, would come down in numbers and massacre the whites, and possibly, which was far more distressing, carry into captivity some of the youths and maidens, which they had done in several instances, but we are digressing. As the last rays of the setting sun were reflected from the mound summits, hope, which with its gentle influence had buoyed up the spirits of Mrs. Clifton through the day, deserted her, and as the dusky hour of twilight deepened, she was seized with fearful apprehensions for the safety of her husband, who had gone out early in the morning with Mr. Moore and others for the purpose of killing a beef, which ran among the rugged defiles of the mountains. In that grassy region, the cattle, unused to restraint, cannot be driven, and therefore beeves are killed, dressed, and conveyed home in wagons, and for the sake of mutual protection from the Indians, the settlers go out in companies. Ye who have never looked upon the red man of the forest, nor seen his moccasin tracks near the door of your own homes, ye who have never seen the tears of the widow and orphan wrung from them by the merciless hand of the savage, can little realize the terror that would seize upon the heart of a wife or mother when a beloved one was delayed a moment beyond the appointed hour of return. Restless and anxious, the lonely wife paced her room, peering now and then into the increasing darkness, only to turn again in disappointment to her desolate fireside and strive to arouse from the depths of despair into which she was fast sinking. A few fruitless efforts were made to prepare the evening meal, but who can nerve herself to the performance of domestic duties when the very blood is congealed with the fear that those for whom she so gladly waits may never again gladden her sight? Weary at length with her weary vigils, Mrs. Clifton, taking her 2 children, a little girl of about 4 summers and a boy 3 years younger, left her house, and passing by the gushing spring, whose dancing waters this night had no power to quiet her perturbed spirits, she threaded her silent way to the house of Mr. Moore, which stood at a short distance from her own home. The cheerfulness of her friend Mrs. Moore reassured her, and being naturally of a lively disposition, she engaged for a time in pleasant conversation. But minutes lengthened into hours, and yet the darkness and stillness without remained unbroken, and the angel of despair, with outspread pinions, overshadowed the inmates of that little cottage. Mrs. Clifton again paced the room to and fro in the vain effort to free herself from its ruthless grasp. She remembered how often her husband, when leaving home, sometimes to travel unarmed the lonely paths over the mountains, in reply to her expressions of anxiety, had said, "Don't fear for me, darling. Remember that a kind providence overrules all things, and that nothing happens by accident." And that with strengthened faith, she would turn again to her household duties, while her lightened heart would bound joyously in this newborn trust. But this night her faith faltered, and with paroxysms of fear, she shook and quivered like an aspen, as her mind reverted to the lonely night vigil of Mrs. Dancer, whose husband had recently been killed by the Indians only a few miles distant. Like faithless Peter, she felt that she was sinking beneath the turbulent waters that were dashing around her, and that none but him, whose voice had power to still the tempestuous waves of Galilee, could now bring comfort. And taking her Bible, which for years had been her great source of light and joy, she endeavored to derive some word of consolation from its sacred pages. But again, like Peter, looking at the angry waves instead of the blessed Savior, she fancied her husband a mangled corpse, slain by the hand of the pitiless savage, and herself a lonely widow, far, far from all she knew and loved, a stranger in a strange land, hundreds of miles away from anyone in whose veins ran a drop of kindred blood. She thought of her little fatherless ones, exposed to the temptations of a cold and faultless world, while her gentle form still trembled with excitement. Mrs. Moore, although troubled herself, used every means in her power to dispel these gloomy fears. But time with weary tread passed on, the solemn hour of midnight approached, and still no tidings came from the absent loved ones. The moon with gentle beams was penetrating the thick branches of the trees that overshadowed the gloomy dwelling. Mrs. Clifton had become a little more calm, but was still restlessly pacing the room, peering out, ever and anon, into the dim moonlight, when the rapid approach of horses' feet along the gravel was heard. With fearful apprehensions, she approached the door and looked out, when discerning a well-known form, with one joyful bound, she sprang into the arms of her husband. Pen fails in the effort to portray the joyful expression that sprang into the sorrowful face in this happy transition from the depths of despair to the blessedness of hope and love. Such were, and such still are, the trials to which the settlers on the frontier of the largest and most delightful of our southern states are exposed. Years have passed. Mrs. Clifton still lives, surrounded now by that picturesque and enchanting scenery of the sunny South, and although time, with delicate pencil, is tracing silvery lines among the folds of her beautiful black hair, she yet retains a vivid remembrance of that terrible night in the little cottage among the mountain fastnesses of the West. This story came from the great state of Wisconsin, being reported in the Door County Advocate of July 10th, 1879. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.